A bride collapses at the altar. A whispered accusation. A long-buried secret no one saw coming. Alina thought she escaped her past, but the man she ran from wasn't just alive. He was watching. What unfolded next shattered her world, her wedding, and everything she thought was true. Who can she trust when even love becomes a lie? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true story dramas like this one. The sun dipped low over the rolling hills of Briar Hollow, casting warm golden light across the centuries-old chapel nestled at the town's edge. Its whitewashed steeple reached proudly into the sky, framed by weeping willows and the distant echo of chirping cicadas. On this quiet spring afternoon, the air felt thick with the kind of stillness that only arrived before something irreversible happened. Inside the chapel, a hush hung heavy in the air. Rows of polished pews were filled with friends and family, all dressed in their Sunday best, fanning themselves gently with printed programs despite the cool air conditioning humming softly above. The scent of lilac and eucalyptus filled the room, wafting from the lavish floral arrangements lining the aisle. Stained glass windows bathed the space in hues of blue and crimson, dancing across the stone floors like a living mosaic. Cameron Hale stood at the altar, tall and composed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His jaw was clean-shaven, his dark hair slicked back with careful precision. There was an easy confidence about him, his shoulders squared, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. But his eyes, a cool steel gray, were scanning the room carefully, flicking past familiar faces until they landed on the heavy double doors at the far end of the aisle. His breath caught. Any moment now. Beside him stood Father Bennett, his ceremonial robe flowing in ivory and gold. Though the priest had officiated more weddings than he could count, there was always something sacred in this moment, the stillness, the anticipation, the breath before the vows. His lined face held the calm of a man seasoned by time, but his eyes were sharp, always watchful. Something today felt different. An unspoken tension clung to the air like mist, clinging to the folds of his robe and settling in the cracks of the old stone. Just behind Cameron, Logan Hale shifted on his feet. Dressed in a charcoal suit that looked slightly rumpled at the shoulders, Cameron's younger brother cut a more rugged figure. Military posture, squared jaw, the faint outline of a service tattoo visible beneath his shirt cuff. His arms remained crossed, and though he kept his expression neutral, his eyes never left the chapel doors. Unlike the others, he wasn't smiling. The first chords of the wedding march broke the silence, and a collective hush fell over the crowd. Heads turned in unison, the double doors creaked open, and there she was. Alina Brooks stepped into view, radiant in white. Her gown hugged her frame with elegant simplicity. No glitter, no lace, just smooth satin flowing like water around her ankles. A cathedral-length veil draped behind her, sheer and whisper-thin, billowing softly as she took her first step forward. The entire room seemed to exhale in admiration. Her hair was swept back into a soft bun, adorned with pearl pins that caught the light with each movement. But behind the beauty there was something else, something Father Bennett noticed instantly. Her smile was there, yes, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gaze was distant, and her steps, though measured, lacked the lightness one would expect from a bride walking toward the man she loved. Her bouquet, a clutch of white orchids and baby's breath, trembled slightly in her hands. The movement was so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not looking closely. Logan saw it too. His brow furrowed and his arms dropped from his chest as he leaned forward ever so slightly. The tension in his frame sharpened, his muscles taut beneath the fabric of his suit. Something wasn't right. Elena continued down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. Her eyes flicked from face to face in the crowd, smiling aunties, old college friends, Cameron's mother dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But she never lingered. It was as if she were trying to pretend they weren't there, as if each step were a silent negotiation with herself. Just a few more. Just keep going. Cameron, watching her, felt his chest tighten, not with fear, not quite, but with something unnameable. He thought she looked perfect. But he noticed the grip she had on her flowers, how her knuckles had gone white. He told himself it was nerves. Everyone was nervous before the big moment. As she reached the altar, Elena paused. Her eyes met his. There was something unreadable in her expression, something guarded. Cameron reached for her hands. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she placed her hand in his. It was cold. Father Bennett cleared his throat. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice smooth and steady, the cadence familiar and comforting. But his mind wandered. Her hand, that tremble, her eyes. He looked again. Beads of sweat clung to her hairline, barely visible, but there. The chapel was cool, even brisk for springtime, yet she looked like someone who had just run a mile. Elena nodded through the priest's words, her posture impeccable, her expression calm, but Father Bennett, ever the observer, saw past the veil of ceremony. He noticed how her chest rose and fell a little too quickly, how her eyes darted once, just once, to Logan, then back to Cameron. The groom whispered something to her, his thumb brushing her knuckles, a soft gesture, a reassuring one. She nodded again, but said nothing. When the time came to speak his vows, Cameron did so with ease. His voice didn't shake. Every word was sincere. He spoke of destiny, of finding in Elena something rare and true. The crowd smiled. Some sniffled quietly. Then it was her turn. The pause was slight, but present. Elena looked at Father Bennett as if hearing his question from far away. She parted her lips. Her voice emerged soft, almost fragile, but the words came. "I do." And yet, as the words echoed, Father Bennett's unease deepened. He had seen people cry at this altar, seen them weep and laugh and shake with emotion. He had seen cold feet and last-minute doubts. But this was different. Elena looked displaced, like a woman walking someone else's path. Logan, meanwhile, hadn't blinked. His gaze was fixed on Elena with military stillness. Something gnawed at him, something instinctual. He didn't like this. He didn't like her eyes. Not the way they kept flitting around like she was searching for the exits. Cameron reached into the velvet-lined box, lifting a delicate ring. Elena followed suit, her hand trembling as she reached for his, and then she wobbled. Not dramatically, just a half-step sideways like a dancer slipping out of rhythm. Her ring clattered to the ground, a tiny crystalline sound that cut through the silence like shattering glass. She recovered quickly, bending to retrieve it, waving off the nearest bridesmaid. She smiled. "I'm okay," she whispered. Father Bennett took a step forward, concern flickering behind his calm eyes. Elena looked up at him. Something in her expression held him in place. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what was happening and knew she couldn't stop it. The guests chuckled softly at the fumble, assuming nerves. Cameron chuckled too, brushing a lock of hair from Elena's cheek. "You sure?" he whispered. She nodded, smiled. "Just nerves." But Logan didn't laugh, and Father Bennett didn't move. Elena took the ring again. This time she slid it onto Cameron's finger. Her hand shook just slightly. Father Bennett noticed it. Logan noticed it. The others saw only the romance of the gesture, the picture-perfect moment. The ceremony moved forward, but the mood had shifted ever so slightly. An intangible change in the air, like the sky moments before a storm. Father Bennett continued with the reading. The sacred words passed his lips, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He glanced at Alina again, trying to decipher the tightness around her eyes, the slight sheen of her skin. The bouquet in her hands was drooping now, her grip too strong. And behind her calm expression there was something lurking, something frayed and ready to snap. In the pews, Cameron's mother smiled, unaware. The guests leaned forward in anticipation of the final vow, the pronouncement that would seal it all. But Father Bennett, for the first time in his career, hesitated. The silence stretched longer than usual. He looked at Elena. Her breathing had become shallow. Her veil clung to her cheek with sweat. Her lips parted, then pressed together again. The priest's pulse quickened. Then Elena blinked once, twice. Her eyes rolled back. She swayed. And then she collapsed. The gasp that swept through the chapel was instant, collective. The bouquet hit the floor with a thud, petals exploding like feathers. Cameron dropped to his knees, cradling her head, shouting her name. Father Bennett surged forward, adrenaline overtaking ritual. Logan was already moving, pushing past shocked guests. In the silence that followed, only Alina's shallow, stuttered breathing could be heard. And everything changed. Cameron knelt beside Elena, his heart pounding as he cupped her face. "Elena? Elena, look at me," he whispered urgently. Her skin was cold, slick with sweat, her eyes fluttering but unfocused. Her chest rose in shallow, uneven gasps. All around them, voices swelled. Confused murmurs, rising panic, gasps that filled the sacred space of the chapel like storm winds howling through stained glass. Father Bennett crouched beside her, his practiced fingers finding the pulse in her neck. It was there, but faint. He looked up, meeting Cameron's desperate gaze, and gave a short nod. "She's alive," he said, though the words did little to calm the growing tension. "She was fine this morning," Cameron stammered, brushing hair from her forehead. "She was nervous, yeah, but she was fine. She said she just needed sleep." Logan had already reached them. He dropped to one knee on Elena's other side, scanning her face, her limbs, her arms. "We need help now," he said, rising quickly and signaling to the ushers. "Call 911. Get the doors open for the paramedics." Father Bennett pressed a hand against Elena's clammy palm. Something felt off. More than nerves, more than fainting. The signs were too distinct. Skin pale, bluish under the fingernails, pulse weak, breath shallow. And now, as she lay barely conscious on the stone floor, her lips parted slightly, her expression twisted in pain or confusion. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. This wasn't nerves, it wasn't stage fright. It was something deeper, darker. A pair of guests at the back of the church darted out the open doors to wave down emergency responders. Cameron remained beside Elena, whispering her name over and over again as if by sheer repetition he could pull her back. Logan hovered nearby, scanning the room, his jaw clenched. He wasn't looking at Elena. He was watching the people. Every face, every flinch, every reaction. "What the hell happened?" he muttered to no one in particular, then looked at Cameron. What did she eat? Drink? Did she take anything? Cameron shook his head. She said she didn't want champagne. Just water this morning. She barely touched her breakfast. Father Bennett felt a chill roll through him as he gently lifted one of Elena's hands. There, on the inside of her arm, half hidden by the lace of her sleeve, was a faint, purplish bruise. He brushed it with his fingers. Not fresh. Not old either. Right over the vein. He looked up sharply. Did she receive any medication recently? Injections? Cameron's brow furrowed. No, not that I know of. Logan leaned in, his voice low and serious. Check the other arm. Father Bennett hesitated, then gently rolled up the opposite sleeve. Another mark. Slight, but unmistakable. A heavy silence fell between the three men. The double doors flew open with a crash and 3 paramedics rushed in, equipment bags bouncing at their sides. One knelt beside Elena immediately, checking her vitals with swift, precise movements. Another began preparing an oxygen mask. She's unresponsive but breathing. Pulse is weak, the lead paramedic said. Look at this, Father Bennett said, gesturing to the bruises on her arms. The paramedic's eyes narrowed. He pulled out a pen light and gently pried one of Elena's eyes open. Pupils are pinpoints, he muttered. Possible opioid overdose. Cameron flinched. What? No, that's impossible. She doesn't do drugs. She wouldn't. We need to administer Narcan, the paramedic interrupted, already drawing the antidote into a syringe. The oxygen mask was placed gently over Elena's face. Time felt warped, every second dragging as though the air itself had thickened. The injection went in clean, then silence. A long, breathless silence. Then, with a violent jolt, Elena's body arched slightly. Her chest rose in a sudden gasp, and her hands twitched. Her eyes flew open, wide and glassy. She coughed. Her breath came in ragged, frantic bursts. Elena, Cameron said, clutching her hand. Hey, it's okay. You're okay now. Her gaze darted across the ceiling, then to the faces around her. She looked at Cameron, then at Father Bennett, and finally her eyes found Logan. A flicker of something, a memory, a name, passed through her expression like a shadow, and then she spoke. It was a whisper, barely audible through the hiss of the oxygen mask, but Father Bennett heard it. Did this to me. The words struck like a lightning bolt. Cameron froze. What? Elena tried to sit up. The paramedics urged her to stay still, but she shook her head weakly. Last night, she said. Her voice cracked, hoarse from oxygen deprivation. My drink. Someone put something in my drink. Father Bennett's face remained composed, but inside his thoughts raced. He looked at Logan, who was staring hard at Cameron now, expression unreadable. You think I... Cameron said, his voice trembling. Elena, no, I would never... Elena's hand reached out and gripped Father Bennett's sleeve. Her knuckles were pale. You believe me, right? She whispered. I believe something happened, he said carefully, and we'll find out the truth. The murmur among the guests turned into something louder. Rumors whispered under veils. Confusion rippled like a wave through the crowd. No one stood, no one sat. The entire chapel felt suspended in time, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The lead paramedic leaned in toward Father Bennett and Logan. We need to transport her. There's more going on here than a simple fainting spell. I'll go with her, Cameron said, standing. But Alina flinched. It was slight, barely a movement, but unmistakable. Her eyes widened, and she pulled her hand away from his. "Don't," she said, breathless. The silence that followed was deafening. Cameron's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Father Bennett took a slow breath. "It might be best if her family went with her," he said gently, nodding toward Logan. "Just until we understand what's going on." Logan didn't speak. He simply moved to Alina's side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as the paramedics readied the stretcher. She relaxed beneath his touch. Cameron watched, his world unraveling one breath at a time. He took a small step back, then another, running a hand through his hair. I don't understand," he whispered. The chapel doors opened wide, letting in the late afternoon light. The stretcher rolled forward. Alina, pale but conscious, looked out across the rows of guests. So many familiar faces now clouded with suspicion and disbelief. Father Bennett followed them out, but not before casting one final glance over his shoulder at Cameron, who now stood alone at the altar, still in his tailored suit, still beneath the soft glow of the stained glass windows. Only now, everything had changed. Logan walked beside the stretcher, silent and alert, his hand never leaving Alina's arm. She turned her head slowly toward him. "They think it was him," she whispered. Logan didn't answer. "But it wasn't," she said. He looked down at her. Her voice was stronger now. It wasn't Cameron, it was someone else. Logan's expression didn't change, but in his eyes something stirred. "Then we find out who," he said. Behind them, the chapel stood silent again. But it wasn't the same stillness from before. It was colder now, tense, like a violin string pulled too tight. Inside, Cameron still stood, unmoving, and somewhere in the back of the church, near the exit doors, someone else slipped away unnoticed. A figure in a dark suit, moving with quiet urgency. The real storm had only just begun. The ambulance pulled away from the chapel in a flurry of flashing lights and fading sirens, carrying Alina toward the nearest hospital, with Logan seated beside her, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He hadn't spoken much during the ride, not beyond answering the paramedics' direct questions. His gaze remained fixed on her pale face, her fingers still trembling slightly even after the Narcan had revived her. Whatever had happened, whoever had done this, he was going to find out. Back inside the chapel, the atmosphere had curdled into something unnatural. The scent of lilacs and candle wax now mingled with the sharp odor of confusion and fear. Guests stood huddled in whispered clusters, their voices low but urgent, their eyes flickering constantly toward the altar where Cameron still stood, like a groom carved from marble, staring into nothing. Father Bennett stood nearby, one hand resting against the edge of the pulpit, the other clutched gently around his crucifix necklace. He watched Cameron carefully, his thoughts a knot of questions. The tremor in Alina's hands, the way she'd flinched from Cameron's touch, the whispered accusation, it was all circling like smoke, with nowhere to land. "She said it was me," Cameron said suddenly, his voice rough with disbelief. "She looked right at me." Father Bennett said nothing at first. Then, "She said someone put something in her drink. That's not quite the same." Cameron turned to him, eyes blazing. "You think I would hurt her? Father, you've known me since I was 12. I grew up in this church." The priest nodded slowly. "And I've watched you become a good man. But I also saw the look in her eyes when she pulled away." Cameron's jaw clenched. She was confused, scared. People say all kinds of things when they wake up in shock. Before Father Bennett could respond, the church doors opened again, and Logan walked in, returning from the hospital with quiet fury etched into every step. His suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled up. His expression was unreadable. "She's stable," he said simply, his voice flat. "They're running more tests. She's resting." Cameron moved toward him. "Did she say anything else? Did she say why she thinks I—" "She didn't say it was you," Logan cut in sharply. "She said someone drugged her. That's it. So let's stop playing defense and start figuring out who the hell did it." Cameron looked momentarily relieved, then defensive. "Are you accusing someone else now? One of the guests?" Logan's eyes were ice. "I'm saying someone at that rehearsal dinner last night wanted her incapacitated. And unless you served her that wine yourself, then we've got more than one possibility to consider." Father Bennett stepped between them. "Enough. This isn't the time for blame. It's the time for truth." A hush fell over them. Outside, the sky had darkened to a dusky gray, casting long shadows across the stained-glass windows. Inside, the church felt smaller now, heavier, like the walls themselves were listening. From behind the altar, someone cleared their throat. Tyler Cross, the best man, stepped forward, his tie loosened and his brow furrowed. "I don't want to stir anything up," he began cautiously, "but Alina and I spoke last night, just the two of us. She seemed tense." Logan turned sharply. "Tense how?" Tyler shrugged, stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Like she had something on her mind. I just chalked it up to nerves, you know, big day and all." "What exactly did she say?" Logan pressed. Tyler paused, thinking. "She said she wasn't sure she deserved to be happy, that sometimes she felt like her past was catching up to her." Cameron frowned. "She never said anything like that to me." Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Maybe because you're not the kind of person people say things like that to." Cameron bristled. "And you are?" "Stop," Father Bennett said again, more firmly this time. "Pointing fingers won't get us anywhere." But Logan's mind was already working through the details. Elena had a past, clearly. Something she hadn't told Cameron. Something she was trying to escape. But secrets didn't usually explode like this unless someone went digging. He looked at Tyler, who suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. "Where were you last night, after the dinner?" Tyler blinked. "What?" "You were with us for most of the night," Logan said. "But then you disappeared. I checked in with Cameron around midnight. You weren't there." Tyler hesitated. "I went for a walk." Logan stepped closer. "For 2 hours? I needed air, man. I'd been drinking. I just wanted some space." "Jesus, are you saying I had something to do with this? And saying you were alone, that makes you a possibility." The room bristled. A few guests, still lingering near the back of the church, took a step closer, their expressions wary. Tyler's jaw tightened. "You think I'd drug her? Why? What the hell would I gain from that?" Father Bennett raised his hand again. "Gentlemen?" "But," Logan cut in, "maybe you weren't the one who planned it. Maybe you're just the one who helped." Tyler laughed bitterly. "You've got no idea what you're talking about." And then, before anyone could respond, there was a voice from the back of the church, soft, almost casual. "That's not entirely true." Every head turned. A man stepped forward from the far end of the pews, lean, clean-shaven, wearing a light gray suit. No one had noticed him before, not really, but now that he moved, everyone stared. There was something wrong, not in his appearance, but in the way he carried himself. Calm, deliberate, as though he'd been waiting for just this moment. Cameron blinked. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled. "Someone who knows a few things. About your bride, about her real name, about what happened 5 years ago." Logan's stomach dropped. Tyler turned to face the stranger, his face gone pale. "No," he said, barely audible. "No, you can't be." "I thought you were dead," Logan said quietly. The man extended a hand as if offering a proper introduction. "Isaac Moore, Elena's former fiancé." The words landed like thunder in the chapel. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. Then Cameron whispered, "That's not possible. Elena said he was gone." "Not dead," Isaac said. "Just missing." Which is a little ironic, considering who last saw me alive. His gaze shifted, settling directly on Logan. "No," Logan said. "No, she never said." "She didn't have to." Isaac took a few more steps forward. "She just had to disappear, change her name, pretend the past never happened." Cameron shook his head slowly. "You're lying." Isaac's smile didn't fade. "Then ask her why she changed her name from Naomi Taylor to Elena Brooks." Logan clenched his fists. "You stay away from her." "Too late," Isaac said calmly. "She was mine first." The air in the chapel grew heavier, every breath laced with suspicion and dread. Cameron looked as though the floor had been ripped out from under him. Tyler was visibly shaking. And Father Bennett, silent now, watched Isaac with a narrowed, unreadable gaze. "You're the one who did this," Logan said, voice low and lethal. "You got to her. You planned this." Isaac gave a small shrug. "I simply gave someone a little nudge. Some context. The truth can be a powerful thing when it's weaponized." He looked to Tyler. "You son of a..." Logan lunged, but Father Bennett held him back with surprising strength. Tyler turned away, face red. "I didn't know it was going to be like this," he muttered. Isaac's smile grew. "Of course you didn't. You thought you were saving a friend. I let you believe it." Cameron took a staggering step backward, as though physically recoiling from the truth unraveling around him. Isaac continued, "She poisoned me with lies, with silence. She ran, and I led her. For a while. But I never stopped watching. And now she's exposed." Logan stepped forward, voice vibrating with fury. "You think this is over?" Isaac's smile vanished. "It's only just begun." And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. Whatever they thought this wedding had been, whatever simple, sacred vows they had come to witness, it had all been a mask, a stage. And someone, somewhere, had just pulled the curtain down. Silence descended upon the chapel like an invisible fog, thick, suffocating, pregnant with disbelief. The stained glass windows, once vibrant with the warmth of afternoon sunlight, now appeared colder, muted, as if the truth revealed had drained the color from the room itself. Isaac stood near the altar, calm and calculated, while Cameron looked like he was unraveling before everyone's eyes. "She lied to all of us," Isaac said softly, but the softness made it more dangerous, more cutting. "To you," he added, turning toward Cameron, "to the church, to the family she was about to marry into. But most of all, she lied to herself, thinking she could escape the past that easily. Father Bennett, standing between Isaac and the others, took a step forward. His voice was steady, though his jaw was tight. "This isn't the place nor the time for your accusations." Isaac offered a hollow smile. "It never is it? The truth always arrives at the wrong moment, but it arrives all the same." From the side aisle, the sound of rushed footsteps echoed, a familiar pair of heels clacking on polished tile. Everyone turned as Alina appeared in the doorway, propped up slightly by Logan. Her skin was pale but no longer ashen. Her lips had regained some color, though her eyes still carried the exhaustion of someone who had stared too long into the dark. She stopped when she saw Isaac. Her breath caught. Her entire body froze. He smiled, slowly, like he'd been expecting her to appear all along. "There she is," he said. "My runaway bride." The words hit like a slap. Elena's hand clutched Logan's arm tighter, but she stood taller, pulling herself upright. "You shouldn't be here." Isaac tilted his head. "And yet I am. Because someone had to stop this farce before it went too far." Cameron looked at Elena now, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a beam of sunlight turned to fire. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "Is your name not Elena?" She couldn't speak right away. Her throat tightened as if each word had to claw its way out. "My name was Naomi Taylor," she said finally, her voice low, clear, and trembling. "I changed it after I left." "Left?" Cameron repeated, incredulous. "You were engaged to this man?" "Yes." The confession sent a ripple through the room. Several guests gasped audibly. Father Bennett closed his eyes for a moment, as though praying silently for strength. "I didn't kill him," Elena said quickly, turning to address the crowd. "He disappeared. I ran, but I never—" She cut herself off, shaking her head. "I didn't know he was alive." Isaac let out a laugh. "That's rich. Really, Naomi, you should be a writer." "Stop calling me that," she snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. "You don't get to say my name. Because it reminds you of who you really are?" Isaac asked smoothly. "Not this porcelain bride-to-be, draped in silk and secrets, but the woman who stood over me while I bled on the bathroom floor." Cameron looked as if the floor beneath him had vanished. What the hell is he talking about? Elena's lips parted, but no sound came out. Isaac continued. "She didn't stab me, no. She just walked away, packed her bags and left me there, unconscious, assuming she'd finally solved her little problem." "That's not what happened," Elena whispered. Logan stepped forward, inserting himself between Isaac and his sister. "Back off." Isaac's eyes narrowed. "Always the hero, aren't you? But you should know something, Logan. Your little protective act doesn't change the truth. Naomi left a man for dead and never looked back." Elena's knees buckled slightly, but Logan's hand was there, steady. "Tell them," he said quietly. She nodded slowly, gathering herself. "That night," she began, "we had another fight. It was nothing new, but this time it was different. He'd been drinking, and something just—" Her voice cracked. "He tried to stop me from leaving. He grabbed me, threw me against the wall. He told me if I walked out, I'd disappear and no one would ever find me." Gasps rippled again. A woman in the front pew whispered something, her hand clutching her partner's. "I fought back. I managed to lock him in the bathroom. I ran. I didn't know if he was alive or dead. I just knew that if I stayed, I'd die there." Cameron's voice came from behind the fog. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena turned to him, eyes brimming. "Because I didn't want to be that woman, the one with the past. I wanted to be someone new, someone clean. But I should have told you. I should have told you everything." The silence that followed was thick with heartbreak. Father Bennett stepped forward again. "We all carry scars," he said gently. "The mistake is in pretending they don't exist." But Isaac wasn't finished. "Even if you believe her version," he said, voice like cold steel, "she still lied. To you, to the law. She vanished without filing a report, without checking if I lived or died." "Because I was terrified," Elena said, her voice hardening. "Because you told me if I ever spoke your name again, you'd bury me in a place no one would find." Isaac blinked, just once, then his mask slipped. For a moment, everyone saw it. The darkness behind the charming exterior. The control. The venom. And then a slow clap broke the tension. It came from Tyler, standing near the wall, pale and trembling, but with a defiant glint in his eye. "Well," he said, voice hollow, "guess I wasn't the only one being manipulated." Isaac looked at him with amused disdain. "Oh, Tyler, you made it so easy. All it took was one phone call, a few blurry photos, a voice of reason telling you that your friend was marrying a black widow." Tyler's mouth tightened. "You said she was dangerous. You said she'd lied about who she was. You never said you were the one she was running from." "I told you enough to make you scared," Isaac said, "and fear is the oldest trick in the book." Cameron stepped forward now. "And the wine, was that your idea?" Isaac gave a small shrug. Elena had to be stopped. A little setback on her big day seemed appropriate. "You drugged her." Cameron's voice shook with fury. "I instructed Tyler," Isaac said smoothly. "He didn't know the full dose. Didn't ask questions, just followed orders." "I didn't know it would almost kill her," Tyler snapped. "You said it would just make her pass out, that it would give me time to talk to her, to stop the wedding." "Lies," Elena whispered, staring at Tyler. "All of it." Father Bennett looked to the police officer who had arrived quietly minutes earlier and was now standing at the edge of the crowd, observing everything with grim detachment. "I think we've heard enough," the priest said. The officer stepped forward. "Mr. Moore, I'm going to need you to come with me." Isaac raised his hands, a sardonic grin playing on his lips. "Of course, arrest the villain. It's what the audience wants." But as he was cuffed and escorted toward the door, he turned one last time toward Elena. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You can change your name, but I'll always be the truth behind your eyes." Then he was gone. Elena stood frozen. Everything around her was moving. Guests rising from pews. Cameron turning away, Logan speaking to the officer. But she stood rooted, her heart pounding like a war drum. And when she finally turned to look at Cameron, he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was walking toward the doors. She wanted to call out, to stop him, but something inside her knew it wouldn't work. Logan moved to her side. "Let him go," he said gently. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But now it's all in the light." She looked around at the chapel, the ruined decorations, the shattered expectations. And then, for the first time, she breathed. Not just a breath of relief, but a breath of truth. The veil had lifted. The performance was over. Now the healing could begin. The chapel emptied slowly, as if the guests weren't sure if they were truly allowed to leave. Most lingered near the exits, hushed voices rising like smoke, heavy with speculation and disbelief. The wedding that was supposed to be perfect had spiraled into something unthinkable. A confession, an arrest, and the reemergence of a man believed to be dead. Some guests glanced back over their shoulders one last time as they walked out, as if expecting the walls themselves to collapse from the sheer weight of what had transpired. Elena sat in the front pew, shoulders slumped, her veil pooled beside her like shed skin. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, white-knuckled, as though she were still bracing for impact. Logan sat next to her, a quiet sentinel, his body still, eyes focused on the floor in front of him. Neither had spoken since Isaac had been led away. Father Bennett stood by the altar, his back to them, his fingers slowly running over the edge of the brass candle holder he'd gripped earlier when things had started to fall apart. He hadn't moved in minutes. It was as if he, too, needed time to comprehend the full scope of what had just unfolded. Then, quietly, Tyler's voice broke the silence. "I didn't know." Elena looked up sharply. Tyler was standing near the side aisle, his suit jacket wrinkled, his shirt half untucked, a man visibly unraveling. He looked more like someone who had just survived a car accident than the polished, best man he'd been hours ago. "I swear to God, Elena, I didn't know it was going to get that bad," he said. I didn't think you'd almost die." Logan's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. "But you knew something. You drugged her. You delivered that glass. Don't pretend you were some kind of pawn." "I was trying to help," Tyler said, stepping forward, his voice rising slightly. "He told me she had a dark past, that she'd ruined lives. He sent me photos, hospital records, said she was dangerous. And I believed him." Elena stood slowly, her gaze steady. "And instead of coming to me, you chose to slip something into my drink? I thought it would calm you down, that you'd tell the truth. I didn't think it would almost kill you." Her jaw clenched. "You were my friend." "I know," Tyler whispered, his eyes beginning to fill. "And I'll hate myself for the rest of my life." There was a beat of silence, and then Father Bennett finally turned around. His voice was low, grave. "Manipulation thrives in darkness. It feeds on secrets, but also on fear. That man, Izzy, he knew how to twist the truth into a weapon. He used both of you." Tyler nodded slowly, eyes downcast. "He told me he wanted to stop the wedding, that it was the only way to keep Cameron safe, and I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now. I see it all now." Logan stood and moved toward him. There was something unreadable in his face. "Tell us everything, every single word he said to you, every message, every call." Tyler nodded. "He reached out 3 weeks ago. Called from a blocked number. Said he had information about Elena, about Naomi. Said she'd changed her name because she was hiding something criminal. At first I didn't buy it, but then he sent proof. A copy of an old engagement announcement, a photo of her and him together, a medical report, bruises, a police report draft that was never filed. It all looked real." "It was real," Elena said quietly, "but not the way he framed it." Tyler looked at her, regret carved into every line of his face. "I didn't question it. I should have. I didn't think he could be lying. He sounded so calm." So reasonable. That's what abusers do, Elena said. They sound reasonable. They make everyone else look crazy. They turn truth into fiction and fiction into truth until no one can tell the difference anymore. Tyler swallowed hard. I'm sorry, I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that. She didn't respond, not with words, just a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all she could give. Logan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Can you forward everything he sent you to me right now? Tyler nodded, already unlocking his phone with trembling hands. As they worked, Cameron re-entered the church. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor, drawing every eye toward him. His tie was gone, the first few buttons of his shirt undone, and his expression was a storm. Betrayal, confusion, grief, all written clearly across his face. Elena turned toward him, unsure of what would come next. He walked slowly down the aisle, stopping a few feet away from her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "About your name? About Isaac? About everything." "Because I was afraid," she said. "Because I thought if I told you who I really was, you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now. I deserved to know," he said, quieter now. "I know," she replied, "and I'm sorry." There was a long pause. Logan and Tyler both stood silent, unmoving. Even Father Bennett seemed to hold his breath. Cameron rubbed a hand over his face. "He could have killed you." She nodded. "He tried." Cameron's voice broke a little. "I would have married you. I would have built a life with you, never knowing, and he would have still been watching." "I know." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching, almost pleading, like he was trying to find the woman he knew beneath the layers of history and pain. "I need time," he said finally, "to figure out what all of this means, to know if I still know who you are." She nodded slowly. "I understand." He stepped back, hands in his pockets. "I still love you," he said. "But I don't know what to do with that right now." Neither did she. He turned and walked out, and Elena felt something inside her fracture. Not a break, but a shift. A letting go. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The clouds had finally gathered, dark and swollen with rain. A storm was coming, or maybe it had already passed. Father Bennett moved beside her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't choose the storm," he said, "but you stood through it. That matters." Elena closed her eyes. Her breath was steady now. Her heartbeat no longer raced. For the first time in years, the fear had quieted. Not gone, but quieter. Logan moved beside her. "You ready to go?" "Yeah," she said, rising to her feet. "I think I am." As they turned to leave, Tyler called out one last time. "Elena?" She paused and looked back. "I'll talk to the police," he said. "I'll tell them everything, whatever it takes." She nodded again, her voice soft. "Thank you." The wind picked up outside, blowing open the chapel doors with a low creak. Rain had begun to fall, slow and heavy, drumming against the stone like the world itself was letting out a long-held breath. Elena stepped through the threshold, veil still in her hand, dress slightly torn at the hem. Behind her lay a ruined altar, a shattered illusion. Ahead of her, uncertainty, but also something else. Possibility. She took her brother's arm, and together they walked out into the rain. Rain fell in soft sheets over the winding roads that led away from the chapel. blurring the world into shifting reflections on pavement and glass. Inside Logan's truck, the silence was thick but not uncomfortable. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the cool window, watching drops race down the glass as if they, too, were running from something. Her veil had been tucked away in a plastic garment bag in the back seat. Her bouquet was gone, left behind in the church like a symbol of everything that had shattered. She didn't speak for a long time, and neither did Logan. They had grown up knowing the value of silence. Not the kind that hides things, but the kind that lets grief stretch its legs. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the gear shift. His jaw was set, his eyes focused on the road, but his mind was clearly somewhere else. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "Do you think he's watching?" Logan glanced at her. "Isaac?" She nodded. He sighed. "I think he's been watching for a long time." Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. "And I never knew. I thought I disappeared well enough." "You did," he said gently. "But people like him, they don't let go. They don't move on. They wait, and they plan." She turned back to the window. Oh, shit. Miss Sally. "No," Logan said firmly. "You shouldn't have to change who you are to stay safe. That's on him, not you." The rain slowed as they neared the outskirts of town, mist curling across the fields like smoke. They drove in silence again for a while until Elena spoke, her voice almost too quiet to hear. "He got inside our heads. All of us. Even Tyler." Logan didn't respond right away. His knuckles whitened slightly on the steering wheel. "I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I drank a little more," she continued. "If the paramedics had arrived a few minutes later, if you hadn't been watching me so closely during the ceremony." "I wasn't watching you because I suspected anything," Logan said. "I was watching you because something didn't feel right. Instinct." Elena gave a bitter laugh. "Your instinct saved me." He shrugged, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Maybe we got lucky." She shook her head. "No, we didn't get lucky. Isaac made a mistake. He miscalculated." Logan raised an eyebrow. "You sound certain." "I am. He didn't expect me to remember. Not so soon. Not so clearly." Her fingers dug into her lap. The memory had returned in jagged pieces just before she collapsed. The bitter taste in the wine, the faint scent of cologne that didn't belong to Cameron, the pressure of Tyler's hand on her back, guiding her to drink. "Something he said doesn't make sense, though," she murmured. "He told Tyler I tried to kill him, that I stood over him and walked away." "He was twisting it," Logan said. "He wants to turn the victim into the villain, make you doubt your own memories." "I don't," she said, her voice firming. "Not anymore." Logan nodded, satisfied. "Good." They pulled up to the safe house, a small, unassuming cottage nestled between rows of pine trees. It belonged to one of Logan's old military buddies, someone who owed him a favor and had left the place stocked and ready. There were no neighbors within half a mile. No one knew they were there. As they got out of the truck, Elena paused, scanning the tree line. Logan followed her gaze. "We're okay here. I swept it twice. Cameras, motion sensors, locks. He won't find you again." She didn't respond. She just walked slowly toward the porch, the hem of her wedding dress trailing through puddles, soaking up rainwater and mud. Logan grabbed a duffel bag from the truck bed and followed her inside. The interior was warm and quiet, wood-paneled walls, soft lamplight, the faint hum of electricity. Elena moved to the fireplace and sat on the edge of the hearth, holding her arms around herself. Logan tossed a blanket her way. "You need to rest." "I can't," she said. "Not yet." He pulled up a chair, sitting across from her. "Then talk." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to keep holding it in," he said. "You've been holding it in for years." She stared into the unlit fireplace, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was distant. "He never hit me. Not at first. That's the thing people never talk about with men like Isaac. It's not the bruises that come first. It's the isolation, the control, the little comments, the rules. I couldn't go out without telling him where I was going. Then I couldn't go unless he went with me. Then I couldn't see my friends. He'd get upset when I wore certain clothes, said I was inviting attention. I thought he was just protective." Logan didn't interrupt. "The night I left," she continued, "he grabbed me by the wrist so hard I thought it was going to break. I pushed him away and locked myself in the bathroom. He was pounding on the door, screaming. I climbed out the window. I ran. You did the right thing," Logan said. "I told myself he was gone," she whispered, "that maybe he'd moved on too, but I knew better. I knew someone like him doesn't forget." Logan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "He's in custody now. The police will get the full story. With Tyler's confession and the evidence on your arms, you've got enough to put him away." Elena didn't look convinced. "Aaron didn't just want to ruin my wedding," she said. "He wanted me to doubt everything, to believe I was still the same scared girl who ran from a man instead of facing him. He wanted to own me again. But he failed." She nodded slowly. "He failed." Just then, Logan's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He picked it up, glanced at the screen, and frowned. "What is it?" Elena asked. He turned the phone toward her. A message had come through, unknown number, no name. "You're not safe. He's not the only one watching." Elena's blood ran cold. Logan stood up immediately, eyes scanning the windows. He moved quickly, checking the locks, arming the alarm system. "Could be a bluff," he muttered. "Could be someone trying to spook us. But what if it's not?" He looked at her, his expression grim. Then someone else was in on it. Someone besides Isaac. Elena stood, her legs shaky. "Tyler said Isaac sent him files, photos, hospital records. Where would he have gotten those?" Logan's mind raced. Someone on the inside. A contact, a hacker, or someone who knew you back then. Her voice trembled. Someone who still does. Another thought occurred to her, sudden and sharp. Cameron. Logan blinked. "What?" "Cameron's company. They specialize in private data encryption. He has access to resources, teams, analysts. If Isaac was watching me all this time, what if he used someone inside Cameron's world to do it? What if this goes deeper than we thought?" Logan's face darkened. If someone helped him, someone with clearance, that's a different kind of threat. "We need to find out who," she said, her voice no longer trembling, "before they come looking for me again." Logan met her gaze. "Then we don't wait." He grabbed his laptop from his bag, powered it up, and pulled a chair next to her. "You're not going to run this time," he said. "You're going to fight." Elena nodded. Her fingers still shook, but there was steel in her spine now. The fear that had haunted her steps for 5 long years had finally met its match, not just in the truth, but in her decision to face it head on. As the storm outside raged on, they began tracing the digital breadcrumbs, every file, every message, every shadowy link between her past and the present. Isaac was gone, but someone else was still watching. And this time, Elena wasn't going to wait for them to strike. The wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the safe house, branches scraping across the windows like skeletal fingers. The storm outside had grown louder, but it was the storm inside that truly rattled Elena. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled around a warm mug of tea she hadn't touched. Logan was hunched over the laptop in the living room, blue light flickering against his face as he scrolled through lines of data, messages, and metadata logs. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was charged, focused. Elena hadn't slept since the wedding. That wasn't. Her white dress was long gone, traded for an oversized hoodie and sweatpants, but she still felt like she was wearing the remnants of that day, like lace had woven itself into her nerves and sequins were stuck in her throat. "Anything?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse. Logan didn't look away from the screen. "There's a digital trail, but whoever sent that message knew what they were doing. Used a masked number routed through a virtual private network. But there's a ping I traced to an IP address that was active around the time Tyler got those files. Might be nothing." Elena set the mug down. "Might be everything." He turned the laptop toward her. "The address is registered to a shell company that's technically part of Hale Dynamics." She blinked. "Cameron's company?" Logan nodded. "A branch of it. One of their security contractors. It's based out of Chicago." She shook her head slowly. "That can't be a coincidence. Cameron mentioned once that he'd contracted third-party analysts for background checks. You think Isaac piggybacked off that?" "It's possible," Logan said. "And, if so, someone within Hale Dynamics might have helped, whether they knew what they were doing or not." Elena leaned back, processing. Her mind spiraled through conversations, details, anything that might confirm what Logan had found. Cameron had always been careful, always professional when it came to business. She remembered him saying once, almost in passing, that he liked having eyes everywhere. Eyes. It made sense, in a terrifying way. She stood abruptly, pacing to the window, arms crossed tight. "So what do we do? We can't confront Cameron directly. He's already spiraling. If we go in guns blazing, he'll shut down. He won't listen." Logan rubbed a hand over his face. "Then we go around him. We talk to someone who can confirm the access logs. Someone in IT. Internal records. There's always a weak point." Elena's eyes narrowed. "What about Jordan?" "He's Cameron's VP of infrastructure. He always struck me as distant, but smart. He liked me, I think, or at least didn't hate me." "Would he talk to you now?" "Maybe," she said. "If I call him and make it about Cameron, about protecting him, he might listen." Logan nodded. "Then call, but keep it vague. No mention of Isaac. Just say it's urgent and you need his help." Elena grabbed her phone and took a deep breath before dialing. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Calm, clipped, professional. "Jordan Kane?" "Jordan, it's Elena." A pause. "Elena, wow. I wasn't expecting, after everything that happened. Are you okay?" She pressed a hand to her temple. Not really. I need to ask you something. It's about the security teams Cameron outsourced to. The digital forensics contractors? I think someone's been using them to dig into me. Silence. I'm not accusing Cameron, she added quickly. I need to know who had access. Jordan exhaled slowly. You're asking a big question. I wouldn't if I wasn't scared, she said. Please, just tell me if anyone flagged my name. Anything unusual. Another pause. Then, give me an hour. When the call ended, Elena lowered the phone and turned to Logan. He's going to look into it. Good, he said. Then we wait. But waiting wasn't easy. Elena tried to sit, but her body wouldn't rest. Her mind kept flicking back to Isaac's last words in the chapel. This isn't over. That message from the unknown number. The possibility that this went beyond Isaac, beyond the twisted revenge of a man she'd once loved. Maybe this wasn't about love at all. The phone buzzed again. She jumped. A text. Jordan, check your email. I sent everything I found. You were right. Someone accessed a flagged file on you 3 days before the wedding. The access point came from a user account tied to Tyler Cross, but the login credentials were authorized by someone else. Elena's fingers shook as she opened the email attachment. A log of entries. Encrypted user data. Timestamps. Brief descriptions. There. Her old name. Naomi Taylor. Accessed. Cross-referenced. Downloaded. The user credentials had been overridden by a higher-level admin. And that admin was none other than Cameron Hale. She stared at the screen, heart pounding. Logan read it over her shoulder. He authorized it. No, she repeated, stepping away. No, he wouldn't do that. He loved me. Logan looked at her carefully. Maybe he thought he did, but something changed. Why would he go looking into me, she said, almost to herself. Why not just ask? Because he didn't want answers, Logan said. He wanted control. Elena dropped into the chair, her mind racing. What if he didn't stop Isaac? What if he helped him, not out of malice, but because he wanted to know the truth without asking me for it? Logan didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. The idea that Cameron, the man who had cradled her hand at the altar, who had promised to protect her, had been digging through her past behind her back, wasn't just a betrayal. It was dangerous. The phone buzzed again. This time, a new number. You're getting close. He knows. Watch your back. Logan grabbed the phone. That's not a warning. It's a threat, Elena said, standing again. And it means someone doesn't want us finding the truth. Her eyes darkened. But I'm done running. She walked to the duffel bag Logan had packed and pulled out a burner phone, then turned to him. I need you to get me into Cameron's system. Logan hesitated. You want to break into his servers? I want the truth, she said. I want to know who helped Isaac. Who else accessed my files? If Cameron lied to me once, he could have lied again. Logan nodded slowly. We'll need VPN shielding, proxy reroutes. I'll run it through 2 ghost IP. He was already at the keyboard, typing fast. Elena stood over him, eyes scanning every line of code, every flicker of data on the screen. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. It took hours, but by the time they breached the system firewall and pulled the encrypted access logs, they had a name. Not Cameron, not Tyler, someone else. Len O'Rourke, Director of Strategic Security for Hale Dynamics. A name Elena had only heard in passing. A woman who operated in the background, never visible, always one step removed from public view. "She's the one," Logan said. She approved the deeper scans, the flagged background pulls. She fed the information to Isaac. "She's the ghost in the machine." Elena's blood chilled. Then it wasn't Cameron after all. But he knew, Logan added. He had to. Someone in his inner circle doesn't act without approval. Elena's throat was dry. So he let it happen, and when it nearly killed me, he stayed silent. A beat passed. Then Logan said what she was too afraid to say out loud. Maybe Isaac wasn't working alone. She turned to him, and in her eyes the fire was back. Not fear, not sorrow. "I want to speak to her," Elena said. "Lena Rourke. I want to look her in the eye and ask her why she tried to destroy my life." Logan stood. "Then let's set a meeting." Outside, the rain had stopped. But the real storm was just beginning. The air in the cafe was warm and thick with the scent of dark roast and cinnamon. Steam rose lazily from mugs scattered across small, round tables. It was the kind of place meant for quiet conversations and stolen glances, not revelations, not confrontations. But that's exactly what Elena was here for. She sat near the window, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked glass, though her mind wasn't really watching the street outside. She wore a black coat, buttoned to the neck, and a knit hat pulled low over her brow. Next to her, Logan nursed a lukewarm espresso, his gaze constantly sweeping the cafe, noting exits, cameras, the man pretending to read a newspaper 2 tables over. Then the door opened, and she walked in. Lena Rourke. Everything about her was precise. Her navy suit tailored to perfection, her blonde hair pinned back in a flawless chignon, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She moved with the confidence of someone used to orchestrating chaos without leaving fingerprints. Her eyes scanned the room, unreadable, until they landed on Elena. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Lena approached, sliding into the seat opposite Elena with practiced ease. She set her phone face down on the table and folded her hands in her lap. "Elena," she said, her voice as smooth as glass. "Or do you prefer Naomi?" Elena's jaw tightened. "You knew? I've known for a while." Elena leaned forward. "Then why didn't you say anything?" Lena tilted her head slightly. "Because it wasn't my business to confront you, but it was my business to protect Hale Dynamics, and unfortunately your past presented a potential threat to our CEO." "A threat?" Elena's voice rose slightly. Logan tensed beside her. "You had a history with an unstable man," Lena said coolly. "A man with ties to surveillance tech and unauthorized data acquisition. We flagged Isaac over a year ago. You, however, never came up until your name started appearing next to Cameron's in our systems. You became a person of interest. Nothing more." "You leaked my past," Elena said, barely keeping her voice steady. "To Isaac. You gave him access." Lena raised a brow. "I didn't leak anything. I investigated a background anomaly, as is standard protocol. It was Tyler who shared that information outside the company." "And Isaac?" "He was already in the system. I was tracking him." Logan's voice was low and dangerous. "That's a convenient excuse." "It's not an excuse," Lena said calmly. "It's a fact. I suspected someone in Cameron's circle was working with Isaac, but I didn't have enough to go on. Tyler was weak, emotionally compromised, easy to manipulate. I gave him access, thinking it would lead to Isaac. I didn't know he'd use it to poison a woman on her wedding day. Elena's eyes narrowed. You expect me to believe this was all some covert sting operation? I expect you to understand that this wasn't about you, Lena said. It was about Cameron. About securing the integrity of a company that handles classified government contracts and private data encryption for people who don't forgive mistakes. But you made one, Logan said. You let a monster in. Lena's expression didn't waver. Yes, she said quietly. I did. For a moment, the cafe's sounds returned. Milk steaming, cups clinking, a barista calling out an order. Then Elena spoke. So now what? She asked. You're here, telling me your side, but what does that fix? I'm not here to fix anything, Lena said. I'm here to warn you. That caught both Elena and Logan off guard. Warn me about what? Elena asked slowly. Lena leaned in, her voice lowering. Isaac wasn't working alone. Logan scoffed. We figured that much out. I don't mean just Tyler, Lena said. There's another player, someone higher, someone who made sure Isaac had access to certain systems after I'd already revoked his credentials, someone who used a ghost account that even I couldn't trace until last night. Elena's blood turned cold. Who? Lena met her eyes. Cameron. The name landed like a brick in Elena's chest. No, she said, shaking her head. No, he wouldn't. He loved me. He might have, Lena said. But that doesn't mean he trusted you, and trust is currency in his world. He began his own investigation after I flagged your file. I thought he was trying to protect you. But it turns out he was protecting himself. Logan sat forward. Are you saying Cameron was behind Isaac's reappearance? I think Cameron reached out to Isaac, Lena said, voice tight. Not knowing what he was truly capable of. I think he believed Isaac could scare you into revealing your past, force the truth into daylight. Cameron didn't want secrets in his marriage, not because he valued honesty, but because he feared exposure. He's building a political future, a Senate run, maybe more. A scandal could kill that. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. So he used me. Lena didn't argue. But Isaac went too far, Logan said. He tried to kill her. Lena nodded. And Cameron panicked. He shut everything down, cut Isaac off, but by then it was too late. Elena looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Lena's voice softened. I came today because I needed you to hear it from someone who wasn't lying to your face. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I made mistakes. But I didn't want you to keep looking for ghosts while the real monster was walking free. Logan stared at her. Why now? Because Cameron is burying evidence, Lena said. Scrubbing logs, rewriting timelines, making it look like he didn't know a thing. But you have the original access files, Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded once. I copied everything before he could touch it. Why? Logan asked. Why risk that? Lena hesitated. Because I've spent years keeping secrets, doing what's necessary in the name of national security. But this crossed a line even I couldn't justify. He nearly killed you, and now he's pretending it never happened. Elena swallowed hard. What are you going to do with the files? I'm giving them to you, Lena said, along with a choice. She pulled a flash drive from her blazer and placed it gently on the table. You can take this and walk away, she said. Use it as leverage if you ever need to, or you can take it public, burn his world down. But if you do, be prepared. He won't go quietly. He has power, allies, money. He'll fight back. Elena stared at the drive. So small, so dangerous. She reached out and picked it up. Lena stood, smoothing her jacket. I'll deny everything if it comes back to me, but you deserve to know the truth, and now you do. Without another word, Lena walked away, her heels clicking softly as she disappeared out the door and into the fog. Elena and Logan sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "What do you want to do?" Elena looked at the drive in her hand. "I want to end this," she said. "For good." Logan nodded. Then they stood, together. The storm was behind them, but the reckoning had just begun. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this intense and emotional story. If you're still here, it means this journey meant something to you, and that means everything to me. This story wasn't just about betrayal or survival. It was about the power of truth and how, even in our darkest moments, we can choose to stop running and start fighting. Elena's story reminds us that no matter how deeply we bury our past, it always finds a way to surface. But when it does, we have a choice: to let it control us or to take control of it. Life is messy, painful, sometimes unfair. But courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up, even when you're terrified, and saying, "No more." Before you go, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please consider subscribing. There are many more stories to come, stories that dive deep, challenge your heart, and stay with you long after the credits roll. Until next time, take care and never be afraid to face the truth.